Before you guys joined us, we were talking, of course, about Star Wars, and I think that's kind of a fair thing to touch upon when a major legal scholar of our times happened to have written a book on Star Wars and the world according to it. So maybe as people are arriving, maybe actually my first question to you, Cass, would be which era in Star Wars, which moment in Star Wars are we in?
Right now in
Yeah.
history of humanity?
As of October
Uh,
2025.
well, what a great question. So we're not in A New Hope because the world isn't taken over by the Empire. We're not in The Empire Strikes Back because we haven't had a skirmish. We're not in uh, the world of Return of the Jedi. We might, if we're in any world at all, I guess it would be um, either Attack of the Clones or the first one with little Anakin, the Phantom Menace. So I think we're in the Phantom Menace. I think if that's where we are and
This
how
is
things.
the Jar Jar Binks moment. That's
Yeah,
terrible.
yeah, yeah. No, no. Well, Jar Jar
Terrible.
Binks he's someplace in the water in
Oh,
the Pacific, and we don't see him. But in terms of where humanity is, closer to that than to anything else.
although I have
And
to say, if you go to some of these right-wing, right boy parties where they talk about how, women should have 10 kids, it does look like the Attack of the Clones.
a little like that. 10 kids is a lot.
There's definitely a little something reminiscent there. Endor's era, says Jess here.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
are super interested in everybody's opinions in the group chat. Please do share your views on which era in Star Wars, in the Star Wars universe, we are currently in. And let me just welcome back to Interintellect, Cass Sunstein. This is actually the first time that you and I are meeting outside Twitter and Substack. You're the Robert Walmsley University professor at Harvard Law School. We know you primarily, I think, from the book Nudge, which was this great bestseller you co-wrote it with Taylor. And still to this day, when we think about great ways to align people across very polarized issues, we think back to Nudge and try to find simple, info-heavy ways of guiding people through this very complicated and heavily, fast-evolving world that we don't have to debate. You don't want to debate every day whether you should stand on the right side of the escalator or to give up your seat to a pregnant lady. We could all probably align on those questions, whether that's her 10th kid or not. And sometimes it's the simplest forms of messaging that works best. That said, your new book on liberalism, which I absolutely adored, and I also very much recommend if you haven't yet subscribed to Cass's Substack to do so immediately. It reinvented the numbered list, how to explain very complicated things very simply. And this is a little bit what On Liberalism is trying to do. There's something liberalism, everybody thinks that they know what we mean by that, but you say that that's not so true. And as a good illustration, you're in I think it's in a Substack post, you're trying to retrace when this book was actually born. And you go all the way back to the early 1970s and even beyond. So it's not just that we don't always know what we mean by liberal. We also don't always know when we became liberals. So do you maybe want to give us, just to kick off, a little bit of a backstory of how this book came to be? Seems to be the hottest topic on Interintellect. We're talking about liberalism so much these days, but we're always in the moment of genesis and definition. So how did you approach this? And it seems like it took a lifetime.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, the proximate source is maybe 3 or 4 years ago when I started on the very laptop into which I'm now speaking, writing a kind of document to myself on liberalism, and it was numbered. It was a list of numbered propositions. It was a lot like, at least in my aspiration, Hayek's Why I Am Not a Conservative, which had that characteristic. And it was too academic, really, to be published in a popular outlet and too impressionistic to be published in an academic journal. So I thought I would never publish it anywhere, and it would just be one of the extremely numerous things that were on my laptop, and no one would see it but me. I sent it to two people. One is Tyler Cowen, and the other is Brett Stevens, and both of them liked it, which surprised me. And both Tyler has, he's, I think, wise as well as amazing. And so the fact that he liked it made me think maybe it wasn't terrible. And Brett Stevens not only liked it, he said you should publish in the New York Times. And I thought that was a preposterous idea because it was super long, as well as it referred to all these people, references to obscure people. And I sent it to the Times and they ran it. And then I got a reaction to it, which was unlike any I've ever received, where the most noteworthy were people on the right who said, I am on the right and I really like this. And one said, I'm on the political right and I'm a conservative, and what I want to conserve is liberalism. And that's someone who I admire greatly and know. And then I got a bunch of notes saying the right has gone anti-liberal or illiberal or post-liberal, and that's a problem, said the conservatives. And then the left wrote me saying there's a lot of illiberal leftists. There are Marxists and there are Stalinists in one sort or another, and there are censors of speech and people who are disrespectful to religion, people who don't believe in the rule of law on the left. And they said, I don't like that. I'm myself on the left, they said, but I'm for liberalism. So receiving particularly enthusiasm from the right, though I wrote it more as a response to the left, to leftist illiberalism, as you say, from my early days at Chicago. When I saw that, I thought, well, maybe I'll do it as a book. And those are the origins. So the first thing with liberalism is to define it. And there's a lot in this book trying to get clear on what it is. But the basic message is simple, which is that there's a holy trinity, and it's freedom, pluralism, and the rule of law. And we can discuss each of them. But if you believe in those three things, welcome to the camp liberalism. It's going to be fun here.
The
There's
big
swimming.
fat liberalism.
The camp liberalism, there's swimming and there's tents and there's tennis, and it's really fun.
And humor, you point out that that liberalism is anti-laughter, which
Yeah,
became even more, poignant with the whole late night show debacle and everything. So
yeah,
yeah, I'm feeling that, as the kids would say.
yeah. The anti laughter we have visible to us. I mean, you and others would know much more about this than I do, but in Eastern Europe, laughter wasn't everywhere. I've been to China, and there are amazing things in China, incredible things and achievements and people, but sometimes laughter isn't the first thing you would point to.
Kundera, everybody go and
Yeah.
read on this. But there was humor in communist Eastern Europe, but it was considered the pressure valve. So they would let you do certain things. The three categories for censorship in communist Hungary under Kádár, starting in 1957, they were called the three T's. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this. Tűrt, tiltott, támogatott, so tolerated, banned, supported. So when your files came in and every single piece of art, everything that was ever written down would end up in front of the censor, and they would do one of the T's. They would stamp it. And if you were banned, then good luck. If you were tolerated, then watch yourself, because next time it might be banned. And if you were supported, well, you could deal with your own morality at home in private, because there were some compromises. One of my favorite lines in all of your work, all of your recent work about liberalism, is, I think it comes up with regard to religious freedoms and this slow slide into theocracy that we are with some trepidation, witnessing right now in the US, to my European self, somewhat completely incomprehensibly, is this question: who do you think you are? And I actually laughed because it was such
Thank
a
you.
good way of in kind of encapsulating the problem here when we are talking about positive freedoms and negative freedoms. A question liberalism keeps asking in the big tent across all these different opinions and kind of aspects of the movement is whenever somebody is really blocking your freedom, you're like, who do you think you are? No, you're quoting Lincoln, like, no man is great enough to kind of like give orders to somebody without their consent. So who do they think they are, those who are currently trying to limit our freedoms?
Yeah. No, this is great. I'm super grateful for that. So you may know most of my writing is errs on the side of flat and more cool, more than fire. And that sentence, who do you think you are? That's not a characteristic sentence. It's kind of characteristic of any of us when we're feeling it. But to put it in a book, that was a risky sentence. But so thank you for not hating it. In the religious context, if you have a society that's pluralistic, I was in an Arab country pretty recently, and I got to meet with one of the leaders of the country, and he talked about he had some tale about Christians and Jews. And the point of the tale was receptivity and openness. And it was a little bit, um, it felt a little bit 1960s as opposed to now, that it felt like openness and toleration were in doubt, and the fact that he was for it was a thing, but full of admiration for him. So this was a guy who really believes in toleration and respect across religious differences, and it was an inspiring moment, even though it sounded, for an American or German or a Canadian or a person in France, it would just be an odd way to talk, as if Christians and Jews are welcome here. That would just be a little, but still he meant it and it was good. So what he thought he was a leader of a pluralistic nation, which was mostly Muslim, but where everyone's welcome here. Everyone's going to be safe. And that's what he thought he was, a person of humility and openness. Now, if you have people in a country who think that, that one way is right, that's great if that's their commitment. That's how they want to live their lives, and they might be correct. But to force other people in that is to assume an authority which no secular power, even a secular power with a keen religious identification, ought to be entitled to have. And, we could even talk theologically in support of that. But whether we go that way or not, compulsory unification of opinion, wrote an American Supreme Court justice, achieves only the unanimity of the graveyard. And while the justice who said that was speaking of free speech, it's even more appropriate in speaking of freedom of religion. We have a lot of graveyards in human history, and many of them are made possible by people who have a particular thought of who they are.
And raises, I would imagine, I think religion in an extreme way raises the question of legitimacy, right? Because nobody's more appointed than someone who considers themselves to have been appointed by God or some other form of supreme being. They will feel at their most humble whilst being the most oppressive.
Yeah.
And we can kind of backtrack from there all forms of non-democratic legitimacy. What gives this? I mean, who do you think you are? Like, literally, what
Yeah.
makes a person think that they can exercise power over somebody else in the cases where there's no demonstrable proof that the people have given this
Oh,
person the power temporarily and they can revoke it.
no, I mean, the different countries have different ways, but for some countries, the separation of church and state is motivated in large part by making things safe for religion. That if they're merged in one or another way, religious believers might be at risk, either because they don't share the dominant view or because those who are pressing the dominant view, even if they're in power, they are targets.
I'm going to stop for a second just for questions if anybody wants to jump in, because I feel like we can't just drop in religion and quickly move on before I dive into my next question. Just going to stop for a moment. If anybody has
Yeah,
a question,
hello,
raise your
Anna
hand.
and Cass. How are you doing? So nice to see you. Nice to meet you virtually here. So, what do you think the post-liberals really want? I think you, in your book, you do a good job of sort of really wondering exactly what the prescription is. We've got regime change, right? Patrick's book and other erudite people making these cases. So, what's the end game? Is it integralism, seriously, or what do you think the vision amounts to?
Well, there are post-liberals of multiple kinds. Putin is in his self-understanding a post-liberal, and we have some sense of the shape of the society he likes. Stalin, there's a great dialogue between Stalin and H.G. Wells. You can get it on Kindle, where they're arguing about basically liberalism. And Stalin had a conception. He spoke actually very impressively. He was more erudite than I expected of a triumph of Marx's vision. So that's one view on the right. On the left, I'm sorry, and you could see, a dictatorship of the proletariat as one shorthand for a post-liberal society. China, you could see as one conception of post-liberalism, and with a lot of market stuff in it, I guess, as an engine of economic growth. Patrick Deneen's form of post-liberalism, I don't really know what's meant by what he wants. I should say anyone who writes a book I admire and salute. Uh, it's an achievement, not for me because I don't think my books are an achievement, but Patrick Deneen to do that, that's an achievement. But I think his conception of liberalism is so murky and undefined that what post-liberalism would look like is also ill-defined. I don't understand integralism very well, and I should say that down the hall is a longtime friend and collaborator of mine, Adrian Vermeulen, and it pains me to be in disagreement with him on these issues. He's really a beloved colleague. And there's some parts of his book on common good constitutionalism that I really like that are very valuable. Now, if post-liberalism means that freedom of speech isn't a thing in the way it now is, and I think some post-liberals think that, then that's a vision. You could have that vision. That would be, in my view, not that's something that we should be excited about, but that would be an idea. So I don't really know. I think there's not clarity on what the post-liberal vision would be. I think there is a sense of what the liberal ills are. And this is, I think, productive of conversation. So kind of welcome it. The liberal ills involve, it's sad, crime and rootlessness and loneliness and alienation and a feeling of spiritual emptiness and an assortment of dystopian products, it is sad, of the liberal commitment to freedom and pluralism. Now, that's something that's worth discussing, I think. In my view, those things are genuinely terrible things, alienation and crime and loneliness, whether they're products of liberalism seems to me unclear in the extreme. If you have a society that values freedom of speech and freedom of religion, that allows people to have diverse views about how it's best to live. I have a friend who wants to have a bookstore. I have a family member who wants to make films. Both of them have made some progress toward their dreams. That's not productive of alienation and loneliness and a feeling of rootlessness in a bad way. So it's clear what some post-liberals think are the bad byproducts of liberalism. I think what should be taken seriously and with respect is the identification of those things as bad things, which opens the question, what are we going to do about them? And it may be that liberalism doesn't have a lot to say about that. Liberal isn't a cure for alienation, or I hope it's not a cause of alienation, but it's not a cure for loneliness. It's a conception of governance. And it makes space for people to find their way toward, like this, a community of people who talk about stuff.
And often these public engagements and public expressions are the best kind of canary in the gold mine. Actually, quite a few people know abroad that after the Fidesz takeover in Hungary, where I'm originally from, and I had already left by then, like many other people in my generation who could afford doing so or were insane enough like myself to try with a little suitcase on my books. The first 1.5 years after it had really become serious, there was a wave of suicides in the film industry. So a lot of, at first, maybe less prominent or more kind of beginner stage, but talent, like real production and directorial talent. And this is a small city, right? And the small film industry. And they'd escalated to a very, very big kind of, apex predator in the industry also going this way. And it was a huge wake-up call to people, because you would think, like, if anything, then a Cannes-winning director who speaks 3 languages and has all these contacts would be exempt. But it's also a moral question. Like, you talk a lot about the moral aspect of liberalism. It's also a feeling that you feel that you are not, that not every day is a matter of life and death. I'm a recent arrival to the United States, and one of the most shocking things that have happened just in my short tenure here so far is that it went from a relatively fun place, towards something that's very familiar to me from like early childhood, when you have life and death questions, or it feels like they make the words into life and death until in some cases it becomes life and death for some people. And I really don't think that is anti-laughter to me, because then really you are in the Umberto Eco territory where you are not supposed to laugh at important things, because then they will fall apart. And that's quite shocking to me. I would like the next couple of questions to revolve around your definitions of anti-liberalism. And I'm starting there on purpose before we go into the different types of liberalism that you enlist in another very helpful numbered list. Because anti-liberalism feels as elusive and hard to define as liberalism, obviously being the kind of counter the pull to it. As liberalism, you say that anti-liberalism is also bipartisan. You express that we are encountering examples of anti-liberalism on the left today in America. You think that the one coming from the right is more perilous. Obviously, they are in power. They have access to all the resources. Could you talk a little bit about why it's anti-liberalism, what differentiates it from post-liberalism and illiberalism, and how to spot one in the wild?
Great. So I should say the book is focused, and the author kind of lived in the period between 1815 and maybe 1970. So the book refers to Putin. It might refer to Hungary and Orban, but we'll get there. But it's focused on those periods. So if we want to get clear on what anti-liberalism is, we need to know what liberalism is. So let's say freedom, with an emphasis on freedom of speech and freedom of religion, has pride of place. That respect for pluralism, understood as diversity of persons and ways of life is essential to what liberalism is committed to respect and cherish. And the rule of law, as a lawyer, I would be drawn to that, but I want all of you to be drawn to it even more than I am. I read when I was a law student a sentence which stuck in my head, which is the history of freedom of English-speaking peoples is in large part a history of procedural safeguards. That's from Felix Frankfurter. It's not exact, but it's pretty close to exact. And I remembered it. I don't know why I remembered it. I remembered it as a really boring sentence by someone who must be old. How could he think that the history of freedom is a freedom of procedural safeguards?
You people run around with the tattoo, right? In Brooklyn, yes.
That's the history of freedom. But of course, he knew what he was talking about, that procedural safeguards mean you have a right to hearing. If you're challenged, you have a right to an independent judiciary, which can protect you against horror, that the world of Kafka isn't going to be your world, that you have an assemblage of requirements that are imposed on the state. The rules have to be clear. You have to get fair notice. And that's the rule of law. And that should be a shining star in the human constellation. So those three, as I say, are the Holy Trinity. There are two others I'd add. One is freedom from fear, and another is democracy. So I put those secondarily because they are kind of more contested parts of liberalism, but let's not fuss. Let's just say liberals believe in freedom from fear, even if Roosevelt was the person who coined the term. It goes back very long ago, and I don't want this to be words. I want this to be like real, that if you're scared that the police may come after you or that there's going to be private violence, then you are in a society which to that extent is violating liberal principles. So what liberal principles say is whether you live in Hungary or Russia or China, you're entitled to be free from fear, which doesn't mean necessarily that you get food and a home. I think ultimately it should mean that, but not necessarily. But it does mean that private and public violence is something you're free from. And for those people, I hope everyone here has not experienced subjection to fear. I can say that I know people who are, let's say, Biden administration formers who are scared. And is it the worst thing in the world? No. Is it unusual? Yes. And some of them, like my former student Comey, he's looking at a criminal indictment. Now let's just bracket the question whether that's warranted, that indictment. I don't think so. But just notice that if you're subject to criminal threat, then we have a potential, at least, violation of the rule of law. It might be consistent with the rule of law. So now that we know something about what liberalism is, if there's a nation in which freedom of speech isn't respected, it's anti-liberal. So I taught in China a number of years ago. I had an amazing group. They were between the age of 30 and 50. All but one were in the Communist Party. I asked them at the end if they do just one assignment, which is to write what China could learn from America or what America could learn from China. And I phrased it deliberately neutrally, and having no idea whether they would take the America needs to learn from China or China needs from America. I wanted them just to write it up. And you're laughing because you know better than I did. They thought America has nothing to learn from China, and China has everything to learn from America. And they all told me that orally, and they said, we're not going to do the assignment. And they were super nice people, and they were, smart and amazing, and they refused to do the assignment. And I was flabbergasted. I said, how come? And they said, we don't know who's going to see it. They didn't have freedom of speech. That's a violation of liberal principles. In contemporary Russia, the rule of law is not exactly flourishing, and that's anti-liberal. Now, it may be that China and Russia, for all their amazing history and their incredible role in World War II and their incredible friendship to anyone from any country. They are in a way easy. But in nations that are broadly speaking liberal, there are anti-liberal moments. And I don't want to pick on any particular president. I have my own views. If people are pro or anti the current president, that's part of freedom. And diversity is extremely important with respect to that kind of thing. But I think it is fair to say that in, let's say, North America and Europe, we've experienced anti-liberal moments over the last decade.
Which also kind of answers our previous question about Star Wars era. To go back to the Phantom Menace.
Yeah.
The Phantom Menace, that should be the title of this salon. We're
Yeah.
trying to understand the Phantom Menace. Peter, we're throwing the mic to British Columbia.
Yeah, hi Cass, and thanks for this book and many other pieces of work over your career. It's really been a wonderful contribution to my way of thinking, and I think a lot of people. And as I've been thinking about your defense and critique of liberty, one of the things that occurs to me, I mean, really the whole point of defending any way of navigating our lives is so that we all get along as best as possible. I mean, that's really the objective. And when I think about what the Enlightenment has given us, I think autonomy is really at the core of it. But I worry that perhaps we have fetishized autonomy to the point where it's biting us in the butt a little bit, because by doing so, communal values become really very diminished. So I'm wondering if you can talk about how that tension between individualism, which runs very powerfully through that country to the south of me. I'm sitting up in Canada, and this notion of communal values where we take care of each other in a meaningful way.
Great. That's great. And I'm noticing the guitar. Okay, so there are two kinds of liberalism that philosophers explore. One is called perfectionist and the other is called political. So perfectionist liberalism says each person should enjoy autonomy in the liberal sense, and that if you aren't living an autonomous life, something's gone wrong. And it might be that in some sense, the government should help out. So on the view that Mill, I think, held, and also Joseph Raz, autonomy really is central, and it's our aspiration for all members of the human race. That might be in tension with communal values. I'll get to that. The political form of liberalism says that it's not about how to have a good life. It's just a political conception. So if you are living a life that, let's say, isn't autonomous, it's one of devotion to community or God or to the environment, and autonomy doesn't loom large for you, devotion does. The political liberal says, welcome, you're welcome here, that you have the freedom to do that. The rule of law is going to protect you. And our commitment to pluralism means you are not going to be disadvantaged in any way. That's not even an entry into the liberal mind, disadvantaging someone who is not living what by one set of liberal rights is an autonomous life. I prefer the political form of liberalism to the perfectionist. It's more humble. On community, I'm thinking it is a great question. And I think some of the most heartfelt objections to liberalism on the part of anti-liberals is kind of in the domain of what you're saying. And it's that liberalism kind of eats up or devours its own social preconditions, that if you go big on autonomy and say, choose, 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 you're free, then communal bonds tend to be uh, uh, destroyed. Okay, here's one way to think about it. See if this works. This, I think my book is inadequate on this count, but there's norms all around that are hardly inconsistent with liberalism, that call for considerateness, generosity, self-sacrifice, kindness, self-restraint, fairness, assistance. And maybe Canada on average does better on these than the United States, but there are places as an honored to be there. I'm always honored to be in Canada. I love Canada. And you can see the culture is, there's no better culture in the world than Canadian culture. Canada is a liberal culture that also has, as you say, you would know much better, but my observation is go to the airport and just everybody's great. And if someone isn't, the Canadians will look at you like, well, why are you acting like that? And that kind of helps to establish a norm. And that's essential to well-functioning societies, including liberal ones. There's some work on norms by liberal thinkers who insist on their importance. And when they start to atrophy, then things get really terrible. There's a book called The Passions and the Interests by Albert Hirschman, which is consistent with your first points, that he says that the reason we have markets and celebrate markets isn't that there's economic growth and there's profits and people have more wealth. It's that people can live together better. So if you're buying a pair of shoes from someone, you don't care what their religion is. You just want to get the shoes. I mean, if things are working well, you have commercial transactions with people who are just very different, and you get to know them and get to like them. And it softens du commerce. My French is not magnificent. Soft commerce, the softening effect of commercial relations. And I was just thinking today, this may be a little too much information for you, but I played squash about an hour ago. That's my sport. Canadians are amazing at squash. I played with an American and lost. He was good, too good. But then I went into the locker room. This is too much information. I saw a guy look super familiar. And it turns out it looked exactly like the guy who lives near me, whose work I go to when my car's broken or when it needs a permit or a tire or whatever. And it's a guy I see all the time. And to say he's a friend is a little too strong, but it's kind of in the vicinity. And, we have a super nice relationship. I really like him. I admire how he runs his operation. And, that's kind of a liberal society. It's, we have a commercial relationship. He helps my car and I pay him for his work, but our relationship is kinder than that. There are norms. And the town I live in Massachusetts, which is Concord, where our country started, it's kind of full of that stuff. Now I think it's fair to say that liberalism doesn't produce those things. I hope it's also fair to say that liberalism doesn't undermine those things, but liberalism is just on another track.
Hi, Professor. I'm really curious about your thoughts on, in the world of AI, the rise of AI and potential AGI and superintelligence, what does free speech mean, where speech is no longer human or easily attributable? Like what counts as speech worth protecting?
Okay, it's such a great question. And seeing on your shirt, it says extraordinary alien, but devil, the deal?
Oh yeah, it's a company's name.
Extraordinary alien. So
I
this
have
is
that visa. Do you have that visa as well? Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm an extraordinary alien as well. Thank you, America.
okay.
Technical term.
Okay, here we go. So okay. A toaster doesn't have freedom of speech. A robot wouldn't have freedom of speech. Freedom of speech would be for persons. If my vacuum cleaner spoke to me saying done, and I said, that's a rude thing to say, it would not have freedom of speech. So AI as such lacks freedom of speech, but we have to be a little careful here. In a science fiction world in which AI is, let's say, sentient in the way people are, then we're in a Star Trek episode with Data, and we might be in a Battlestar Galactica episode. I love Battlestar Galactica. The not the original, which was a little silly. The one where the Cylons were more advanced and kind of were very hard to distinguish from people. Some of our heroes turned out to be Cylons. Who knew? Am I losing you all? Watch Battlestar Galactica. It's
I
great.
think Jess picked up on this. What am I losing out on? Battlestar Galactica as a civic.
It's so good. Everybody should watch it, and you will all be so scared of AI afterwards.
Yeah, Jess, you're completely right. And your capital letters are warranted in the chat. So then we would have a science fiction question about whether AI is persons, but we're very far away from that. If they're super intelligent in the sense that they can figure things out with the general competence or more than we have, they wouldn't be persons. So basically, let's start by saying they're not persons. But if the government said that AI can't generate material that's critical of one political party, that would violate the First Amendment because it would be viewpoint discrimination, and viewpoint discrimination is unacceptable. If the government said that you can't use AI to commit fraud, that would be fine because fraud isn't protected by free speech principles. If you said you can't discuss foreign policy via AI, that would violate the First Amendment because it would be a form of subject matter discrimination, and that's not allowed. If there are people behind AI who are using prompts or generating AI, and their ability to do what they want to do is being imposed on by the government, then we have a free speech issue. So I've tried to describe certain categories where we know how to handle them. No free speech rights for AI, check. Viewpoint discrimination by government that affects AI, X, not allowed. Restrictions on people who are engaging with AI or on people who are producing AI, those raise First Amendment questions.
And that it's going to speak through us, right? It's going to tell people what to say, often in writing. So the toaster words are going to be my words. And so it's my freedom of speech that it's my right to free speech will safeguard the toaster's right to free speech in a kind of strange new way.
Yeah, this is great. So, and some of this is unresolved. I tried to discuss the things that seem fairly clear. If a student at a university uses AI to produce her essay, let's say, and the university says you can't do that, it has to be your work, that doesn't violate First Amendment rights. If a professor at a university tries to get tenure with an AI-generated article, first, good luck with that. And second, because they're not very good yet. Second, if you do it and the university says it's terrific, but it's not yours, that wouldn't violate any First Amendment or free speech principle. So, but if you're trying to use AI to produce a speech, let's say that is about why cigarettes should be banned, and the government says you can't do that, then we're talking about a free speech issue.
I always try to kind of follow the sequence to its culmination and imagine the implant. And I often think about the earpiece or the teleprompter for a news reporter. So is that you speaking? You will be attacked for it as a person.
We need to know what the government's restriction is. If the government says you can't use AI to generate news text. Then we have what's called a content neutral restriction on speech. That is, it doesn't depend on the content. It's not saying that you can't express a view about what's happening in Ukraine or you can't discuss Ukraine. It's content neutral, but we need to know, why is the government doing it? So if you said you can't protest on the streets, I'm sorry, it says you can't go on the streets to engage in speech-related activity. That would be a content neutral restriction on speech, but it would be struck down, because why are you banning people from engaging in speech on the streets? There isn't a good reason. If you said you can't speak loudly on streets between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., that's okay, because you're trying to help people to sleep. You're saying no loudness between 1 a.m. People are sleeping. That's a sufficient, almost certainly a sufficient justification. So we need to know, is that this kind of technical, but I hope fun, is the government discriminating against a point of view? If so, it's almost certainly violating free speech principles. Is the government regulating speech on the basis of content? It's in big trouble. That is, the government's in big trouble. Is it acting in a content neutral fashion? Then it's more likely to be able to survive free speech scrutiny, but the government had better come up with a pretty reasonable justification.
Well, in my personal experience from Hungary, it's always a little bit murky. So the restriction is not straight on. You were talking about rule of law and people living in fear. When I was a young woman in Budapest, a lot of people, because of how the tax law was arranged, were just like not able to create invoices as themselves. So they would just ask a friend for an invoice and like repay them. And the government kind of allowed this to go on for a long time. And so technically everybody lived in fear, especially journalists who were like contractors, freelancers, because they could just like pick on you. And everybody had some little thing like that with enormous fines, or like enormous in proportion. There was no banning of assembly in Budapest. They just paved up first they closed the opposition newspapers and disabled their fundings through changing the advertising laws, which seemed unrelated. And then when there was nowhere to report on it, they paved up the entire square in front of the parliament building, where this is why they close bridges these days when people want to demonstrate, because the main square for it, where people could express their views, is just gone. And we used to live there around the corner from the parliament when I was growing up in the late 80s and 90s. And in the late 80s, very often we had to just like evacuate because there was such a huge anti-communist demonstration, and people paid sometimes with their lives. Like that was the kind of baton era. And then, the contemporary era is just smarter. They just make the space go away.
Right, this is great. So let's talk about that a little. That's fantastic about freedom. So there are doctrines, principles in many liberal societies which say that public spaces have to be open to expressive activity, and that's protecting against even content neutral restrictions, as you say, and it's completely fundamental to say that the American term is public forums. So streets and parks are public forums. They can't be closed off from expressive activity. And what I loved in your comments, I learned from them, but also connecting this idea of openness of space with freedom from fear. And I think Americans in particular, maybe Canadians too, have underrated freedom from fear because they haven't been subjected to fear. There's an idea that rights typically come from wrongs, which is not to say that, our best moral conception of rights come from wrongs, but as a matter of social practice, the rights we enjoy are an outgrowth of experienced wrongs. And, the protections of the Bill of Rights are kind of lived experience of people rights being intruded on. And I think we've underrated, you wouldn't, Anna, but maybe the rest of us would, the massive importance of freedom from fear. My wife was UN ambassador, and I knew a little bit the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, who's an amazing person at the time. And just talking to him, he was very, protective of his country and loved his country, but you got a sense of what fear is.
I mean, it's coming back to America, right? If you look at what's happening with immigrants in this country, those videos don't remind one of happier places or happier times.
Right. Jess has just said a great comment. Black Americans do not underrate freedom from fear. Can I tell you a story? I taught at the University of Chicago for a long time, and I was walking across the Midway with a white professor friend and a black professor friend. And the white professor friend said, you know, we all have problems with the police, that if you're a male, at least in America, probably if you're female too, if you're over the age of 30, you've had a problem with the police. So I don't see this as a racially coded thing. And the black professor said, let me tell you a story. I was driving in Massachusetts with three black friends. The police officer stopped us. I was a law student at the time, slammed us up against the door, drew guns on us, and kept us there with guns trained on us, the three of us, for 45 minutes, where they purported to be searching our IDs and trying to make sure that we weren't criminals. Told that story. And then he looked at me and he looked at my white colleague and said, did that ever happen to you? That's, of course I would remember that. It's a guy who isn't, known for coming up with very, what's the right word, unforgettable stories. He's just a great guy. And when he said, that ever happened to you, there was a little fire in the statement. But the reason I remember it is, my gosh, nothing like that could imaginably happen. And so, Jess, a salute to you.
And to have that kind of respect for other people's experience. I remember a couple of years ago, famously liberal, well-known American, we wanted to meet up for a cafe, and he was like, come to whatever address. He was visiting the city somewhere in America. And I told him I'm not going to that area because it's dangerous. And he says, what are you talking about? Like, well, the hotels are here. Like, yeah, it's not dangerous for you. It's dangerous for a woman to go there at 8 p.m. and I'm not going there. So I think there are all these layers to it. But then, Cass, it would be dangerous for you to go into an area in the world where maybe for, I don't know, locals or something, it would be a complete no-brainer and they would fear nothing. So traveling widely and talking to people pays out greatly, greatly there. I'm going to stop here for a moment because some very, very interesting points came up, just if there are questions. And then I would love to talk a little bit about the 4 types of freedoms. If you have questions, just raise your hand. Ravi, go for it.
Yeah, thanks for the discussion so far. And I'm looking forward to reading the book. One of the concerns that I have with liberalism is the concern that it's possible that the historical and material conditions that enabled certain things in the past might no longer be true with just the technology and power dynamics. So, for example, what does freedom of speech mean, or freedom of the press mean, if there's the media model is now based on engagement rather than the printing press model, or freedom of search and seizure? What does that mean when we might have advanced AI that can do predictive crime analytics and analyze your psychology and determine guilt or something before you're able to make a case for yourself in a rationally mediated way? So I was curious if there are any kind of structural challenges to liberalism that you see that go beyond just convincing people to align on the same values, and if so, how might those be addressed?
That's fantastic. So if we could get alignment on not coughing in response to good questions, that would be positive, but also on freedom, pluralism, and the rule of law. That would be, I think, for many nations, a big advance. It wouldn't be enough, as you say. So the freedom of search from unreasonable searches and seizures, which is part of the security that liberals prize, you're completely right that it may be that we need new safeguards to protect against intrusions that don't involve people actually coming into your house. I think that's completely right. And it's a work in progress to define what that looks like. If people can figure out everything that's in your house just by virtue of having access to your laptop or your phone, that's a big problem. I was in a conversation with someone who worked in the US government recently who said you should stop talking about that because your phone is on. That's my dog, by the way. That's my dog. Your phone is on, and governments, including foreign governments, can figure out what you're saying. I wasn't saying anything particularly sensitive. I'm not sure that it's true, but that supports your point. So we need safeguards. And that this is a project. This is a doable project. So we have some safeguards in place that we didn't 40 years ago. With freedom of speech, I'm thinking a good start is to let people say what they need to say, and also to forbid government from discriminating against people because of their point of view. But you're right, it's not enough. So exactly how to handle where we are in speech terms, it's also a work in progress. We have works on falsehoods and what scope of falsehoods should we allow to be protected. I make a little crack at this in my book, not adequate. But what John Dewey said about the United States is that be the evils what they may, the experiment is not played out. The United States are not a finished fact to be categorically assessed. And same is true of liberalism.
Yeah, cool. I like that optimism about that. So thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Adam. Great to see you.
Oh, nice to see you. So I was wondering about, in the American context, you said that some of the illiberal thinkers are stronger in terms of their pointing out challenges or problems with liberalism as opposed to defining an alternative. And I was wondering if you could speak more to that. So many of the much of the discourse surrounding crime, urban crime, for example, seems to rely on the availability heuristic, pointing to anecdotes, and not really based in, strong data. And a lot of the objections to, the liberalism's impact on anomie and a sense of pointlessness in life, that might rely on a conflation of, or failing to distinguish perfectionist liberalism from political liberalism. So I was just wondering if you could talk a bit about, among the illiberal thinkers, what you think their strongest objections are to liberalism, and why you think they are good objections.
But we're not asking you to explain integralism, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I shared a link here if anybody wants to dive deep into it.
So I really like thinking about what's correct in views that I don't hold. So I kind of live for that in a way. And there's an approach to constitutional interpretation called originalism, which says you interpret the Constitution in accordance with its original public meaning. And I've spent a long time arguing against that, but I can explain why it's good. That is, it tries to discipline judges and promote rule of law values. And it points rightly to evils or risks with other approaches, which might uncabin judges to do what they want. So these are fair. I wish I could say that anti-liberal or illiberal approaches have rightly pointed to the following three problems with liberalism. But candor compels my answer, which is I don't have any such list. So I think it's fair to say that anti-liberal or illiberal thinkers on the left and the right have pointed to very serious problems in liberal societies. So the fact that we have serious crime problems is partly a matter of perception with the availability heuristic, but it's partly just real. The fact that there are people who are suffering loneliness or feeling meaningless, that's real. But that's not liberalism's doing. So the idea that you have freedom of speech, respect for pluralism, and the rule of law, that's not the source of those problems. So I'd say there are problems, and by all means, let's address them. But let's not blame them on coffee, and let's not blame them on soda water, and let's not blame them on the fact that many of us have 5 fingers on our right hands. That's not the source of the problem. So I wouldn't want to say that anti-liberal thinkers are better at addressing the evils of liberalism than in describing their alternative. The what Roosevelt said about what he was surrounded by, I think is fair. He said they call it a new order. It is not new and it is not order.
This is in the beautiful coda of the book where you show us that freedom and order are actually not so incompatible. I mean, Interintellect couldn't exist without a liberal order. I could not have started this project in Hungary. And I often feel that whilst you do see stronger and tighter knit communities in some locations lacking of freedoms, but that's a coping mechanism. That's because if you can't count on the rule of law, you can't count on running a free business, of course you will run a business with your uncle and everybody will stick together because otherwise you are unsafe. And so the negotiation is, are you able to put up, at least in my view or how I run my life and this company, is are you willing to feel a little bit unsafe that comes with autonomy, that you are not surrounded by your 500 brothers and sisters? That's not necessarily freedom. Jess, is it about Battlestar Galactica? Please, at least add a little bit of that. I don't know anything about it. I know Star Wars, but nothing else.
It is not, but I do think we should invite the professor back to talk about science fiction
Yes.
and
Oh my God,
and democracy and liberalism and all of these other things, because there's
I would
so
love
many
that.
shows out there that
Yeah,
are
we can talk
not
about
just Star Wars,
not just Star Wars, Star Trek,
Star
Solaris,
Trek, Battlestar Galactica,
Maximum,
The Expanse, if anybody's recently seen
Hitchhiker's Guide.
The underrated Robert Charles Wilson, who is a Canadian and a completely phenomenal science fiction writer. And I recommend particularly Mysterium and the Chronoliths.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. But I do have, I think, kind of in relation to what you were just saying, that liberalism, or being a liberal small L versus being a liberal big L, has gotten so confused in the past, I don't know how many years, and forces against it, either knowingly or unknowingly, are confusing it and continuing to confuse it. And I wonder if this is, a continuation of anti-intellectualism because they just don't want people to understand liberalism, or if this is, a long-term plan to get rid of liberalism because they want to just, conflate it with being a lefty Democrat or democratic socialist or whatever. Because I do think that it has a marketing problem. And I wonder, like, in this day and age, in this modern day and age, how do we get people to understand these differences?
That's great also. I'm thinking that conservatism at some point in the remembered past had an extremely serious marketing problem. And there was a successful effort to describe what it was, that Russell Kirk was a guy who had like 10 principles of what conservatism is. William F. Buckley Jr. was probably the principal kind of publicist of conservative thinking, and it became a thing, conservatism. It helped elect President Reagan, and it made conservatism. I listen to conservative radio when I drive into work, and it's a thing, and it's the word conservative is deployed with pride, and great, let's honor that. Liberalism could mean the liberal political tradition, which Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, as well as Barack Obama and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, are part of. So that's the liberal tradition. It could mean left of center in the United States. So Obama would be a liberal and George W. Bush wouldn't be. That's you can use the word that way. I gather in Europe, liberal often means market friendly, and so kind of right, as distinguished from social democrats. And these are, I think, not a result of anything other than just usage. So, a word like horse, that's a species, but what HOARSE, that's a matter of usage. We know what horse means, both the animal and the way of talking. So its usage has done that. But one of at least my goals in this little book is to put a spotlight on liberalism as a political tradition, that it's a beacon. It's a thing of great beauty and something to be celebrated and grateful for. And, you could say that about conservatism, depending on what's being conserved. But societies that have experimented, let's say, with departing from the rule of law or rejecting pluralism, there tends to be a lot of suffering and death.
And conservatism kind of lost its own definition when it became kind of too much of common knowledge, when everybody thought they knew it doesn't have to be defined anymore because we all know what it is. And redefining it actually helped in the least likely moment. And so I really love that you're continuing this tradition in On Liberalism, where you're trying to just first define it. Everybody's arguing about this thing and nobody actually stops to see what are we even talking about? Are we meaning the same things? Because it's too much taken for granted. I'm going to take Jenny and Mark your questions. I don't know which one it is, or it's a joint question.
I should apologize and say in about 3 minutes I have to go to dinner, because the liberal tradition is dinner.
In 3 minutes?
Is that okay?
Yeah. And then Jenny, Mark, your question will be the coda here, and we will continue at another time.
No. Oh, am I asking?
Yeah, go ahead now.
Oh. I'm not muted. Okay. Yeah. No, you mentioned, thank you. This is great. The importance of the rule of law and procedural safeguards as an element of liberalism. And I'm wondering, what about the importance of norms, like things that maybe may not technically break the law, but they've never been tried before, and with enough power and the ability to use that power in new ways or abuse it, there are ways to abuse the social contract or the public trust with, some of that might break laws, some might not, but how important are those kind of assumptions and norms?
That's also a fantastic question. So I've had 3 stints as a bureaucrat myself, and I can report that government officials are surrounded by norms which are constraining. You just don't do this. And they may not take the form of laws, so you violate the norm and can get away with it. We need to say what they are. Here's one norm: you don't do things that are illegal, even if were you to do them, you could get away with it. That's a norm. And that's essential. As is not being late for dinner. It's a norm. So this has been a fantastic discussion.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Cass.
Absolute joy. And if anybody wants to stay on a little bit more, because we have around 15 minutes more to go, I will be here and we can talk more about Cass in his absence. That's also a liberal norm.
Thank you, Anna, for being
Thank you so much for being here. Take care.